Good day, everybody. Today we're going to start discussing the different processes that control the energy in our cells. This section, 9.1, is just going to be dealing with the basics of photosynthesis and cell respiration. Just to kind of give you a little brief overview before we actually get started. Energy in living systems, everybody, is responsible for maintaining the homeostasis. We discussed homeostasis back with the cell membrane. We said that in order to maintain that internal state, a cell is going to have to allow certain materials to pass in and out of the cell. But more important than that, since we are going to need to build things, maintain things, we're going to need energy. Okay, we're going to have to maintain that stable environment. It's going to require some sort of energy to be put in. Much like the way if you don't invest energy into maintaining your home, the house is eventually going to deteriorate and fall down just from the changes in the environment. You might think of hailstorms damaging a roof. Well, if you don't get back up there and repair the roof, that's going to lead to other damage on the inside of the house. So, just like a home requires a constant input of energy or money, a cell needs a constant inflow of energy to maintain all the internal workings of that cell. Now, we don't use heat energy or light energy to maintain all the cell processes. We're going to use chemical energy. Now, chemical energy, energy stored in chemical bonds. The way the plant stores energy is through a process called photosynthesis. Words comes from photo, which means light, and synthesis, which means to make something. So therefore, photosynthesis is the making of sugar from carbon dioxide and water using the sun's energy. All right, so this is how we trap the energy from the sun and bring it into the ecosystem. Now, autotrophs, also known as plants, comes from the word auto, which means self, and troph, which means feeding. So the word autotroph, basically self-feeding. Therefore, we're talking about plants and algae, certain bacteria. They're going to, feed themselves. They will make their own food. All other organisms that don't make their own food are called heterotrophs. So they get their energy from either eating autotrophs or other heterotrophs. What they're trying to do is they're trying to get the food in, because that is going to be where the fuel for the cell is going to be. The energy stored in those chemical bonds is going to be broken down and released throughout the cell, so the cell can maintain all of its processes. Okay? Now that energy coming from the cell, or coming from the food, is stored in the form of ATP. We'll talk more about that later in this lecture. ATP is an abbreviation for adenosine triphosphate, and the energy stored in our food makes mostly ATP, but it also generates some heat. And heat is basically random energy, and it's not going to be used within the ecosystem. We're more concerned about the ATP that's being produced. Now, when I talk about metabolism, I'm talking about all the all the changes that go on inside the body, either building molecules or breaking down molecules. And in this section here, we're going to be looking at how metabolism, which is some reactions of building molecules or breaking them down, affect the carbon cycle. Now, in building molecules, there's lots of reactions inside the body that build molecules. Some build carbohydrates, some build nucleic acids, but we're going to be focusing on only one right now, dealing with energy, and that is photosynthesis. Like we said it before, this is the process of using the sun's energy to combine carbon dioxide and water into making glucose. Now, we're converting glucose and water into, converting CO2 and water, say that one more time. Converting carbon dioxide and water into glucose is the main process of photosynthesis. Now, it does take place inside the plant structures called the chloroplasts. Now, there's lots of other breakdown mechanisms we could look at, but we're going to be looking at only one in particular. This is called cell respiration. Cell respiration basically takes the glucose that's made inside the plants and then transferred to other organisms, breaking it down and forming carbon dioxide and water. So it's basically the reverse of photosynthesis. Now, in the process of breaking down glucose and making CO2 and water, you're also going to create molecules of ATP. Again, adenosine triphosphate. Now, the majority of these ATP molecules are made in a structure called the mitochondria. If you remember back to our unit on the cells, I described the mitochondria as the carbohydrate factory of the cell. I also described the chloroplast, I described the mitochondria as the powerhouse of the cell. And I described the chloroplast as the carbohydrate factory of the cell, because that's what's going on in each one of these. I'm going to walk you through the carbon cycle and the flow of energy as it relates to photosynthesis and cell respiration. So as you look at it, first of all, obviously, ultimately, all energy comes from the sun. The sun transfers this energy through electromagnetic waves, which reach the plants, and in particular the structure inside the plant called the chloroplast. Now, the chloroplast is going to take some raw materials, that being carbon dioxide as a gas and water as a liquid. Those two substances, when they are entered inside the chloroplast and energy supplied from the sun, is going to undergo a process called photosynthesis. And the photosynthesis is going to make glucose and oxygen. Okay, so what we've done is this. Carbon dioxide is a very small molecule, therefore it contains very, very little energy. When you combine several glucose molecules together, you make a very unstable compound called glucose. So carbon dioxide is the stable form of carbon. The glucose is the unstable form. Now, given enough time, the glucose will break down back into carbon dioxide and water, but with very little release of energy if it's done very slowly. Inside living things, these two substances combine together in a structure called the mitochondria. Through a series of reactions called cell respiration, you return the water and CO2, but you also produce massive amounts of energy in the form of a molecule called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. Now, I've been talking about ATP here, but now it's time to take a closer look at this molecule. ATP has been described as the energy transfer compound of the cell. It's a portable form of energy, which simply means that it can be made in one part of the cell and used in other parts. Now, on my test, I'm not going to have you identify the parts of an ATP molecule like over here. The most important part of this ATP molecule is this part, the 3 phosphate groups. These 3 phosphate groups are all negatively charged. So when you put 3 of them together like this, you've got 3 negative charges constantly trying to repel each other. Okay, so they're not very attractive to each other. They're trying to push away. Now, any little bit of jarring will break off this 3rd phosphate group. When that 3rd phosphate group is broken off and transferred, basically work is being done. So we've got some energy released. That's how we get our energy to operate the sodium-potassium pump, as you saw in the last unit here on membrane transport. But it's also how the muscle fibers release, so you can start a new contraction. So ATP is important for muscle contractions, nerve impulse conductions, all those important functions of a living thing. Now, it's important though that this ATP molecule get restored. If you break this off, you have adenosine diphosphate, only 2 phosphates. Through a process of cell respiration, we're going to add that 3rd phosphate group back on there. And we're going to add the 3rd phosphate group onto the ADP and restore ATP, and now we can undergo some more processes. We can do some more work inside the cell. As I've described this many times, this ATP molecule is kind of like cash. If, for example, I took my check from my school district and went to the Quickie Mart and said, here's my check, I need some gasoline and a Snickers candy bar, they aren't going to give it to me. I have to first of all go to the bank where I cash my check, and now I can go back and I can buy my gasoline and Snickers bar. Okay, so in my analogy in this case, my check is kind of like a glucose molecule. I really can't use it to spend, although it's got the potential to be spent. I can't spend it, but if I cash it out, now I can do things. Now I can buy things. The process of making ATP is common in both photosynthesis and cell respiration. Okay, so we're going to look at this real quick little process right here. It's called chemiosmosis. You find it both in photosynthesis and cell respiration. We're just going to do it really quick here. We aren't going to go into a lot of detail here. Basically what happens is this. There's an enzyme that's going to catalyze or produce ATP. That enzyme is appropriately named ATP synthase. Whenever you see ASC at the end of a word, that is usually designated as an enzyme. And in my model here, this would be ATP synthase. All right? This ATP synthase acts as both a carrier protein for hydrogen and an enzyme. What happens is this. Electrons are being transferred through different processes in cell respiration and photosynthesis. Ignoring a lot of those steps here, we're going to just kind of briefly describe this. This is an electron transport chain, this list of carrier proteins right through here. What happens is the electrons are passed from one carrier protein to the next, each one going from a higher energy state to a lower energy state. Every time these electrons are passed from one state to the other, hydrogen ions from inside are pumped out to where we build up a huge concentration of hydrogen ions, protons, out here on the outside. Like a huge dam, this ATP synthase is kind of like a big dam. When the concentration of hydrogens out here are really high, they will start flowing down the concentration gradient through this carrier protein, which is called ATP synthase, and that movement supplies energy here to stick another phosphate group onto ADP, forming ATP. That's why this enzyme is called ATP synthase, because we are making more ATP.